In the corridors of power, where the whispers are louder than the speeches, and every handshake carries the weight of history, there comes a moment when the world leans in. This was one of those moments. Behind closed doors, far from the flashing cameras and the choreographed smiles, two leaders sat face to face. The air was heavy, not with ceremony, but with candor, the subject. A man whose voice has carried India's foreign policy across continents. A man who has been both diplomat and strategist, Jaishankar. What followed was not the exchange of pleasantries, but the exchange of truths. One spoke of alliances tested by time, the other of a nation's unyielding sovereignty. They spoke of trade, of security, of the fragile balance that holds the modern world together. And somewhere in that conversation was the unspoken acknowledgement that every decision made in that room would echo across oceans. It wasn't about power for its own sake. It was about leverage, about influence, about the quiet tug of war that shapes the fate of nations. And though the words may never be officially confirmed, the tone, the intent, the weight of that discussion has already slipped beyond the walls that contained it. Because in politics, nothing stays hidden forever. The truth always finds a crack to seep through. And when it does, it reminds us that history is not written in press releases, but in the unguarded moments when leaders stop performing and start revealing. And so, as the world speculates on what was said, one thing is certain. The meeting between these two men was not just a conversation. It was a chapter in the ongoing story of our time, a story that will continue to unfold long after the doors have closed. Behind the closed doors of high office, where the air is thick with unspoken tensions, the meeting began with an unassuming calm. The public would never see this room, never feel the hum of its silence, or the weight of the decisions being prepared inside. This was not the place for grand gestures or rehearsed lines meant for television cameras. It was a sanctuary for truth, a space where the masks of diplomacy could slip, if only for a moment. Here, two of the world's most influential figures sat across from each other, separated only by a polished table, but united by the knowledge that what they said in the next hour could alter the course of international affairs. The curtains were drawn, shielding the conversation from the eyes of the outside world. No press, no aide shuffling papers, no interruptions. Just the sound of voices, low and deliberate, cutting through the stillness like a slow, steady drumbeat. In this place, every word was currency, and every silence was a negotiation in itself. It was here that the posturing of public politics gave way to the raw mechanics of leadership. Away from the podiums and bright lights, the truth came easier, but it also cut deeper. There was no need for theatrics, only precision. They spoke with the kind of candor that could never be risked in front of microphones. Details were laid bare, vulnerabilities revealed, strategies discussed with the confidence that no outsider could twist them into headlines. It was not a conversation for history books, at least not yet, but it was a conversation that would write history all the same. The stakes were enormous. And both men knew that once they stepped out of that room, they would return to their roles, their rehearsed lines, and the public theater that leaders are bound to perform. But here in this sealed chamber of influence, they were just two players on the grand chessboard of the world, moving pieces with the knowledge that each decision would ripple far beyond these walls. It was a meeting few would ever know about, but its consequences would not remain invisible for long. In this rare and private space, the story of nations was being written in real time, in whispers that would eventually find their way into the world. The conversation soon centered on a figure whose presence loomed large despite his absence from the room. Jaishankar, a name synonymous with precision in diplomacy, had become the focal point of the discussion. His career had been a tapestry of negotiations, strategic foresight and an unyielding defense of his nation's interests. Both leaders understood that to speak of him was to speak of more than a man. It was to speak of a symbol, a strategist whose influence reached far beyond his official title. They weighed his words from past summits, dissected his stances on trade disputes, security alliances, and the delicate balance between cooperation and sovereignty. Each assessment was measured, deliberate, acknowledging that his approach to international relations had altered the tone and direction of conversations on the global stage. One leader recalled moments when Jaishankar's calm yet assertive diplomacy had diffused tensions that could have escalated into full-blown conflicts. The other considered how his unwavering defense of his nation's autonomy often put him at odds with powerful states, yet still commanded respect. They spoke of his ability to turn subtle gestures into statements of intent and how he used silence as effectively as speech. This was not a casual exchange. It was an examination, a quiet analysis of a man who had become a central player in the intricate game of geopolitics. In their voices, there was both respect and calculation. Respect for the intellect and discipline that Jaishankar brought to every negotiation, and calculation for how his methods could shape future alliances or strain existing ones. They understood that in diplomacy, personalities matter as much as policies, and Jaishankar's personality had left a deep imprint on the course of his country's foreign affairs. He was not a diplomat content to follow scripts. He wrote them, rewrote them, and at times tore them apart to fit the needs of the moment. To discuss him in such a setting was not to gossip, but to strategize. His influence was a factor they could not ignore, a variable in every equation they ran through their minds. They both knew that while policies may shift and leaders may change, the imprint of a skilled diplomat could last for decades, shaping perceptions and relationships long after the meetings were over. And in that room, behind those guarded walls, they spoke of Jaishankar not as a passing subject, but as a cornerstone in the architecture of modern international diplomacy. Their dialogue moved naturally into the realms that defined the future of nations: alliances, sovereignty, trade, and security. These were not abstract concepts to them. They were the pillars upon which the weight of their countries rested. Alliances, they agreed, were as fragile as they were necessary. Built on mutual benefit and trust, they could strengthen a nation's standing in the world. Yet with one wrong move, they could fracture, leaving both parties vulnerable. They spoke of partnerships forged over decades, the quiet agreements and unspoken understandings that kept them alive, and the calculated risks sometimes taken to test their strength. Sovereignty was a word that carried an almost sacred weight in that room. It was not just about borders and flags. It was about the right to act without the shadow of another's influence. One leader emphasized the dangers of allowing outside pressures to dictate a country's internal decisions, while the other reflected on the delicate dance between maintaining independence and engaging in cooperative global action. They both knew that sovereignty could be eroded not in a single blow, but in the small incremental concessions made over time. From there, their attention turned to trade, an arena where power was often exercised not through military might, but through economic leverage. They discussed tariffs, market access, and the subtle ways trade agreements could bind nations together as tightly as treaties of defense. For them, trade was not merely the exchange of goods. It was a strategic instrument capable of both fostering peace and sparking conflict, depending on how it was wielded. And then there was security, the invisible shield that every nation depended on, yet rarely displayed in full view. Security meant military strength, yes, but it also meant intelligence networks, cyber defense, and the quiet prevention of threats before they could be named. They examined shared security interests, potential threats from emerging powers, and the ways in which mutual defense commitments could either cement alliances or create obligations that might one day become burdens. In that room, these topics were not discussed in isolation, but as interconnected threads of a single tapestry. Every decision about trade affected sovereignty, every security agreement touched on alliances, and each alliance influenced trade. It was the endless loop of statecraft where no move could be made without shifting something else on the board, and where the smallest miscalculation could have consequences felt far beyond their own shores. As the conversation unfolded, it became clear to both men that the implications of their words would stretch far beyond the confines of that quiet room. Every agreement they might reach, every subtle shift in tone or promise made had the potential to ripple outward across continents. This was not simply a matter of two nations shaping their own destinies. It was the shaping of the global stage itself. In the delicate ecosystem of international relations, even the smallest change in posture between two powerful leaders could alter the calculations of allies, unsettle rivals, and shift the balance in regions thousands of miles away. They understood that the modern world was more connected than at any point in history. A handshake here could spark optimism in distant markets. A frown, a pause, a carefully chosen word could raise questions in foreign ministries from Asia to Europe to the Americas. The weight of that reality was not lost on them. This was why their conversation carried such gravity, because in an era when alliances could be strengthened or fractured by a single leaked statement, they could not afford a misstep. They spoke in measured tones, aware that even within these private walls, history had a way of slipping through cracks. They considered the reactions of other world leaders, the responses of international organizations, and the shifts that might occur in trade patterns or security commitments once word of their meeting inevitably reached outside ears. Neither man underestimated the importance of perception. They knew that in diplomacy, perception could be as powerful as truth itself. The stakes were more than bilateral. They were global. If they chose cooperation, it could lead to renewed stability in regions prone to unrest, potentially inspiring other nations to follow suit. If they drifted toward disagreement, the consequences could reverberate in ways that no amount of damage control could fully contain. They were playing on a board where every piece was connected, and the slightest move could change the entire game. In that awareness, there was a shared understanding. Whatever emerged from this meeting would not simply be between them. The aftershocks would be felt by governments, economies, and ordinary people around the world. It was a burden they had carried before. But in this moment, it felt heavier, as if the future itself was leaning in, waiting to see which way the scales would tip. In the world they inhabited, secrecy was a currency, but it was one that could never be hoarded forever. They both knew that in politics, there are no walls thick enough, no doors strong enough to keep the truth from eventually slipping into the light. A whisper here, a hint there, and before long, the substance of even the most guarded conversation would find its way into the public domain. It was the nature of the age they lived in, an age of relentless media scrutiny, digital leaks, and a global audience eager for revelations. What was once the privilege of classified rooms and confidential files now lived under the constant threat of exposure. They acknowledged that the people beyond those walls would eventually form their own stories about what had happened inside. Some would speculate with accuracy, others would weave narratives out of fragments and guesses. But in the end, truth has a way of threading itself through the noise. Sometimes it emerged slowly, shaped by official statements and careful disclosures. Other times it came in a sudden flood, a leak that no one had anticipated, but that could not be stopped. And once it was out, there was no undoing it. They spoke with a certain acceptance of this reality. Every leader, no matter how skilled, must navigate the thin line between what is said in private and what is known in public. It was a line that shifted constantly, often without warning. They both understood the dangers, how a single out of context sentence could spark diplomatic tension, how a misunderstood remark could spiral into a media storm.
Yeah.
Yet they also knew that secrecy was not meant to last forever. It was meant to buy time, to allow decisions to be made without the immediate pressure of public opinion. In the end, it was not a question of if the world would learn of their conversation, but when and how. They could attempt to control the narrative, but they could never truly own it. The truth, once freed, would belong to everyone, interpreted, debated, celebrated, or condemned. And so they spoke with that inevitability in mind, aware that what they said here would one day exist beyond this room, stripped of the privacy that had once protected it, and laid bare for all to judge. It was both the risk and the price of leadership in an age where nothing stays hidden for long. What transpired in that quiet chamber was more than a passing conversation. It was the crafting of a moment that would settle into the larger arc of political history. Long after the specifics were forgotten, the essence of that meeting would remain two figures representing vast and complex nations, engaged in the kind of candid dialogue that shapes the currents of the future. History is rarely written in the grand speeches delivered to the masses. More often, it is forged in the stillness, in those rare moments when leaders set aside ceremony and speak without the weight of the stage pressing down on them. This was one of those rare moments. They were not simply exchanging opinions. They were defining terms, setting boundaries, and testing each other's resolve. These were the kind of talks that create quiet turning points, the ones that rarely make headlines, but alter the trajectory of relationships between nations. The room itself seemed to carry the awareness of this as though its walls had witnessed enough to understand the gravity of what was being said. Every pause, every careful choice of words became part of a delicate negotiation, not just for the present, but for the years and decades ahead. Outside, the world moved on, unaware that a subtle shift in the balance of power might already be underway. A policy could be influenced, an alliance strengthened or strained, a diplomatic stance recalibrated, all as the result of decisions and understandings formed in this private exchange. History, in its truest form, is often invisible at the moment it is made. Only later, in hindsight, do people trace its origins back to such gatherings and realize their significance. The men in that room understood this intimately. They had been part of enough such encounters to know that the fate of nations is not decided in the glare of cameras, but in the understated clarity of private conversation. What they shared here would be carried forward in the choices they made, the messages they sent, and the stances they held firm on in public. It was the invisible ink of history, quiet, concealed, yet indelible. And though the world might never hear the exact words spoken, it would, in time, feel their weight. For moments like this were never truly contained. They were seeds planted in the soil of history, destined to grow in ways no one could fully predict.